Welcome back to the Berlin Dialogue on Business and Human Rights. My name is Julie Schindel, and I'm your moderator today. Welcome to those of you who are just joining us now. Remember, if you haven't been able to join us for the entire day together, you can always access the full recording of this event on the YouTube channel of the Foreign Office after the event. So I'm very pleased to kick us off in this session with a robust discussion that we've been teasing all day, and that is what is going on at the European level, what are the developments when it comes to mandatory due diligence measures, and in fact that bigger picture around a comprehensive framework. To bring us into our discussion today, we have a short recorded message from Didier Reynders, the EU Commissioner for Justice and Consumers.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to address you today. This is a busy year for all of us. Next month marks 10 years since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles. Our hosts, Germany, are preparing mandatory corporate due diligence rules. It will soon be one of 3 EU countries with binding rules in place. And later this year, the European Commission should also be ready to adopt a new legislative proposal. In this proposal, we are aiming to set EU-wide binding due diligence rules for global supply chains. One of the principal motivations behind this is exactly what you will be discussing in just a minute: the need to create a level playing field in the European Union. I'm sorry I can't be there, live, with you today. But I'm very happy that the Commission will be represented by the Director-General of DG Justice, Salla Saastamonen. Salla is overseeing the Commission services leading this important work at the moment. The need to create a level playing field in the internal market is clear. As I mentioned, only some EU member states are legislating in this field. Only some EU businesses have due diligence processes in place. And there are many non-EU companies generating important turnover in the internal market that are not always subject to the same rules as European companies. But creating a level playing field is not just about ensuring economic fairness in the market. It is also about ensuring that every company contributes to protecting human rights and sustainability. We are talking about due diligence to address human rights violations and sustainability to protect our common planet. To ensure that everyone contributes to these common goals, our research has clearly shown that legally binding rules are the only way to achieve progress. As I said last year when I addressed the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, the world needs a new global business model. A business model that is more equal, more just, more sustainable, and more resilient. The Commission would like EU-wide rules in line with international standards that oblige companies to identify and seize, mitigate or prevent actual and potential harm linked to their own operations, their products and services, and their upstream and downstream value chains. We want large companies to align their strategies with science-based environmental objectives such as the 2050 net zero carbon emission target. We also believe it is the role of company directors to help build this new global business model. They have a role to identify all sustainability matters, set science-based and measurable sustainability targets, integrate these in the corporate strategy, and implement the strategy. At the same time, we'll take care of easing the burden for SMEs. There are many ways this can be addressed, one of which is identifying sectors and activities more prone to adverse human rights or environmental impacts. We are aiming to lead by example. What we really need is an international level playing field, underpinned by the UN guiding principles and global climate commitments. This is what an EU framework will contribute to. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to Commissioner Reynders for giving us those words to kick us off. This has been a pretty anticipated focus session for us today, so I'm very pleased to have these three panelists with us to kick us off on the big questions of, are we entering a new chapter, and what are the expectations around this forthcoming EU-wide mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. So on this panel, we have some terrific speakers this afternoon, and we have Ms. Salla Sastamoinen, the Acting Director General at the Directorate General for Justice and Consumers at the European Commission. We have Mr. Bernd Lange, Member of European Parliament and Chairman of the European Parliament Committee on International Trade. And we have Mr. Björn Böning, the State Secretary at the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs here in Berlin. So thank you all for being with us. Ms. Sastamoinen, I want to turn straight to you. We just heard from the Commissioner a bit of a high-level preview of what we might expect with these mandatory due diligence measures. Can you provide us with any additional updates or insights about what to expect?
Good afternoon. And thank you very much for the invitation to celebrate this 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I'm happy indeed to build on what the Commissioner already laid down on this ambitious agenda for the new global business model. For this, the Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative, in honoring the EU's international commitments that were mentioned, commitments to protect the human rights, to mitigate the climate change, our initiative would envisage a holistic approach where the corporate due diligence obligation is underpinned by the company director's duties. So at least these two aspects. So firstly, we aim to clarify the director's duties, a duty of care in the best interest of the company. This means that the interest of all its stakeholders to best serve the long-term interest of the company. Secondly, it's important that the directors identify the sustainability matters, that they set sustainability targets and integrate these into the company strategy. The business strategy should cover sustainability matters. That is the integrated model. And thirdly, actual and potential adverse impacts that the company causes or is foreseeable associated in its supply chain or value chain, these should be captured through the corporate due diligence duty. In that regard, as mentioned just earlier by the Commissioner, we want to build on the already well-known, already acknowledged UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The European Parliament has given a resolution on the matter, and this Parliament resolution is an important milestone, as well as also a building block in our work on developing an EU-level mandatory horizontal due diligence requirement. These background, or these are the sources also for our impact assessment that is being carried out. Naturally, part of this assessing impact is that is a very consultative process. And in this process, there are still a number of issues that are also outstanding, such as the question of the personal and material scope of the initiative. So which companies exactly will have duties? Concerning the enforcement, the regime could possibly have combined duties of the civil liability and then administrative supervision. These are being considered. These specificities, and including then the enforcement that is even across the member states, are all estimated in our impact assessment that I mentioned. We have to look at the policy options, both benefits, and then assess the cost of the impacts. And that work is currently going on. I mentioned that this is a consultative process. So the important source have been also the stakeholder feedbacks. We had an open public consultation that generated a really important feedback of almost 500,000 respondents. In very broad manner, the stakeholders recognize that the voluntary approaches and reporting have not brought the necessary behavioral change and thus expressed support for a mandatory approach. In this consultation, also the leveling of the playing field was acknowledged, recognized as one of the benefits for the work at the EU legal framework, so for the level on the European side. The summary of this consultation is available in the Commission's better regulation portal. Our initiative, the Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative, can be expected later this year. And my last point to make in this first introduction is that we need to ensure full coherence with all the other fellow European Green Deal initiatives that the Commission is currently preparing or that has already proposed. All these support the same overarching objectives. So we have to pay particular attention to aligning all the requirements and making the packages coherent so that we avoid duplication or unnecessary burden for the companies under their scope. So today is again an excellent opportunity to exchange views, which will inform further the preparation of our initiative and that will help us jointly to build a new global business model. And I would like to thank you for that, and I'm looking for our panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sestemoinen, for those remarks about some of the key considerations in the legislative initiative that you and your team are working on. I now want to turn over to our other two speakers on this panel, because I'm sure they're going to have some reactions to what we've heard this morning, and they've been deeply involved in the issue of mandatory due diligence, both at the EU level and here in Germany at the national level. So first, I'd like to turn to Mr. Bernd Lange, who is a member of European Parliament. Mr. Lange, you have been involved in the drafting of the resolution that was then passed in March of this year, which put forth a vision for what mandatory due diligence measures should look like. Indeed, it proposed language of what a directive could say. And we saw that that resolution passed with what I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we can consider as strong support, and support that crosses the aisle between, across the full political spectrum at the European Parliament. What should we understand from the way that this resolution passed, the support it enjoyed and enjoys, and how that might influence the future work on mandatory due diligence measures?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks a lot for this really important event. And this is really also the background of our really intensive discussion inside the European Parliament. As you know, we are trying also to improve the protection of human rights in our trade agreements. We have always the Trade and Sustainable Chapter. We discussed a lot how to really enforce them. But trade in the past 20 years has really changed. Now we have more than 70% of trade which is linked to supply chain, to global supply chain. Such a smartphone is now having a journey from about 32,000 kilometers behind, crossing, if you take all the ingredients, the raw materials, the intermediates together, this smartphone crossed more than 100 borders. And regarding this, of course, we discussed how really can benefit trade to the protection of human rights in global supply chain. And therefore, we took our initiative a few years ago on a small example for some products, for so-called conflict minerals, looking on gold, on tantal, wolfram, and tin, and make an example how supply chains could be linked to binding mandatory due diligence. And learning from this lesson, we indeed had a really intensive cross-border and cross-nationality discussion inside the European Parliament, going in the same direction as we did in the conflict minerals. So it's clear that we want to have a risk-based approach, looking to the concrete possible violation of human rights, labor rights, environmental standards in concrete areas of the whole supply chain. And this we discussed for a long time, because there was also the idea to stop in the tier one section of the supply chain. But of course, there are so many risks of loopholes and not covering the real risk of violation in the whole supply chain, that at the end of the day, we really agreed to take the whole supply chain in our view. And yes, we have, of course, different situations. I guess sometimes getting syrup, ahorn syrup from Canada has a different risk than cacao from Ghana. And this has to be recognized in the legislation as well, and also in the concrete reaction of creating a risk management approach to improve the situation. This was a really important step to get a huge majority inside the European Parliament. And as you rightly said, we had now in the vote 504 votes in favor. As you know, we have 700 members in the European Parliament. And this is a really, really huge step, covering from the left over the Greens to the Social Democrats to the Liberals, and also including the Conservatives into this big majority for this approach. And I'm quite convinced that we are going ahead with this quite innovative approach in the discussion with Commissioner Reinders and Zeller on the proposal for legislation. So yes, there is a clear wish and a clear will inside the European Parliament to use trade, to use the whole supply chain to improve the situation for the people on the ground.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lange, for those remarks and giving us insights about what we might understand from the way that that resolution was voted on as well. I want to now turn from the European level and take it back to the German level at a member state level, and that's here in Germany. We have Mr. Björn Böning here. And Mr. Böning, obviously, Germany, as we've referenced numerous times today, has on the table proposed legislation around human rights due diligence expectations for companies. And as we heard already this afternoon, there are key issues to consider around, well, how many companies does it apply to? How deep in their supply chain should they be conducting this due diligence? Big questions we're facing. Can you share with us a bit some of your key thoughts on how Germany's proposed legislation aligns with what we're hearing may be coming out of the European Union, and how it might diverge from that?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I think protecting human rights is a European responsibility, and is a responsibility for every member state, and also responsibility for every citizen and every company. And I think it's important to say this in the beginning. And you asked in the beginning, is there a new, or are we entering a new chapter? And I think we should enter a new chapter. And we know that still today, 150 million child workers are in the world. We know that 40 million people are forced to labor. And so I think it's time to act now, and it's time to find a common regulatory framework in the European Union. Besides that, what member states have to do. And so we welcome and support the initiative of the European Parliament, and also the initiative of Commissioner Reinders to find solutions for sustainable supply chains and a regulatory framework. So it's an important opportunity for the European Union and its member states to close governance gaps in human rights protection along global supply chains. And I think there's a need for policymakers to intervene with HRDD legislation to create a common framework for all as part of their duty to protect human rights. The EU and member states must ensure the company based in the European Union must may meet their responsibilities along global supply chain. And so a legally binding EU standards has the potential to improve the situation of people along global supply chains on the ground, as Bernd Lange already said. So I think it's very encouraging that during our Germany's Council presidency last year, the 27 EU member states have adopted a far-reaching Council conclusions on human rights and decent work in global supply chains. Jointly, the member states have called on the Commission to table a proposal for an EU legal framework on sustainable corporate governance, including cross-sector corporate human and environmental due diligence obligations along global supply chains. As you all know, and that's the situation these days in Germany, the German Federal Cabinet adopted the draft Act on Corporate Due Diligence in Supply Chains in March, and I hope it will be passed by Parliament by the end of June. It's a strong support for every European initiative, but it's also a German position. And I think if we compare this to other member states that found legal frameworks for sustainable supply chains, the German position is a clear and a strict position for human rights. And I think it's necessary that we, as already mentioned, we need to look at the whole supply chains, not only at tier one, that we have a clear enforcement, and that we also have clear legal objections for the companies so that they know what they have to do, and so that they also know that they can work for legal certainty. And I think the German Act is a very good proposal for every discussion that we have. And so we need to provide companies with clarity on what they need to do, respect human rights in their own operations and their networks. And so EU legislation on the other side should provide companies with orientation, legal certainty, and security of action, and set uniform requirements for all, creating fair competition, because engagement for human rights is one aspect. The other aspect is fair competition, so that the companies who are doing well have not an unfair competition to other companies. So that's very important also to mention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bunning, for those remarks. I want to go here to some questions. Mr. Lange, you referenced in your remarks, I think your words were a very intensive debate around what would go in this resolution. For example, around critical questions such as how far in the supply chain should companies be conducting due diligence? We know that this is one of the divergent factors between what is in the draft German legislation and what is in the EU Parliament resolution. So in these discussions, the discussions landed in a different place. Can you provide us with some insights? You went through the process of debating and discussing with colleagues in the Parliament what should be the expectation here, particularly around scope, for example, and also the accountability mechanisms. How did you manage to overcome some of the concerns? How did the debate fold out? I think for other member states, it may be interesting to hear those insights as they attempt to consider how they might legislate this at home.
Yeah, of course. We started, as I mentioned, looking on the concrete risk. And of course, there is sometimes you have a big company really performing quite well, with a lot of people working for this company, where the risk is quite minimal, even in their supplier in the second or third step. Or you have a quite small company, a mining company, for example, which has really a big impact on the environment and perhaps on the living conditions for indigenous people. And this is also related to the situation in different countries. You know, we have in the unsustainable fishery legislation the possibilities to set green, yellow and red cards, because the risks in different countries are also different. So this was really the focus point, to look where is the risk and how different the risk is in different steps of the supply chain and in different countries. And this was the criteria to look for the whole supply chain and looking also to a lot of companies included in this legislation. And of course, you need, as Björn said, clarity in your responsibilities. And therefore, we want to have also really clear obligations for the companies, also linked to the risk and, of course, to the size and to the involvement in the whole supply chain for the different size of companies. That's also totally clear. And I think it's a quite pragmatic proposal. Similar we did in the conflict minerals, where, of course, the responsibility for the Bank of the Netherlands, a big importer of gold, is quite different to a small goldsmith around the corner. And therefore, we should really go ahead with this risk-based approach.
Thank you very much for that. You used just now the word pragmatic. I want to take a moment and pose a very pragmatic question that has come in from our audience. This is a question for Ms. Sastamonen. People want to know timing. The question is when can we expect to see a draft of the proposed legislative initiative coming from DG Justice?
Thank you for that question. We have worked on the subject since, I think, 2018, when we announced the analytical work on the due diligence, on the director's duties in the framework of the sustainable financing strategy. And work is still going on. So it is in the Commission work program for this year, 21. We are still in the phase of the impact assessment. As I said, we have received a lot of replies to our public consultation, and we are still continue receiving views, taking into account like discussions today. So it will coming, the work is going on, it is progressing. One point what I mentioned, that we have to also take into account the other Commission work. And when we are talking about the proposal, it takes in a quite broad way into account the human rights, environmental and climate aspects. So that way it has a broad scope of looking what are those that influence. And specifically in the climate and environment, the Commission is very active currently and is coming out with packages of proposals. And now we are also on the phase of taking into account this interlinkage and to have a coherent presentation. So I cannot give you a precise date. It is in our work program for this year, and that is something sure that we are going to keep that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I want to go back to Mr. Boning for a moment here. And I know that here in Germany, it's been an evolving discussion or debate, if I may say, around what is the expectation for companies, what is the expected standard, and what is feasible, and how can we support business to fulfill their responsibilities under the guiding principles. Germany transitioned from an initial voluntary approach and has now taken the step to say, we think a mandatory approach is needed. Can you share with us some of the learnings and experiences along that journey, going from the voluntary approach to the mandatory approach, and potentially also evolutions that we'll see in the coming years around the definition of the mandatory measures?
Well, as you know, we had really difficult negotiations over the last months and the last years, day and night. And so it wasn't easy to find a solution for things like scope, for enforcement, for a new authority. So what we saw over the discussions over the last years is that voluntary framework helped us to find solutions between stakeholders like NGOs and trade unions And on the other side, companies, some companies who were really fast in their sustainable supply chains engagement, and others who aren't. And so it helped us to find a common understanding of what companies have to do, what they should do, and also what they can or can't do. And so I think we learned from each other, and it helped us also during the negotiations to hold contact to stakeholders who are critical to our discussion, and also to social partners who have different positions on such a mandatory supply chain act. And so we found solutions like the Corporate Social Responsibility Forum, where every stakeholder are presented. And we found also direct links to the discussions in companies, especially in small and media companies who haven't these big bodies who are engaged in sustainable supply chains. And so I want to say that in the end, it's not only done within a regulatory framework. We also have to give support to companies so that they can do best, and that they know what it means if they have to be engaged in human rights and sustainable supply chains from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 and so on, because we want to address the situation on the ground. And that's the main important thing in my opinion.
Thank you very much for that. We've got another question coming in from the audience, which I think pertains exactly to the situation on the ground. We know that companies can and should take many preventative measures, but sometimes human rights harms still happen in connection with business activity. And the question is, how do we ensure that affected people have access to remedy? And so one of our tough questions coming in from our audience that I believe goes again to Ms. Sestermoinen, which is, what will be the role of civil liability in forthcoming EU mandatory due diligence measures?
Thank you. That question indeed relates to this enforcement. As also the State Secretary said, the state enforcement issues are one of those quite complex when considering the initiative also at the European level. If they have been at the national level, they are also in the European level. And here it is the civil liability is one of the options with the administrative liability. And then we have to look for the civil liability, naturally, or remember that it would be the liability of the company, and how that is then linked to each national current system. What our initiative, our current tool would be a directive. So it could be that in the directive, it is in the general level that that in which cases, maybe also taking account the risks, as was said also by the Lange, that requires then various obligations to the different companies when we talk about holistic, but we have to take also into account indeed that the risks are not the same, and maybe the obligations are then stronger depending on the companies, either or size or the sector. That was what our commission also referred to. And there also then when and which type of the companies the civil liability is linked, that is still under discussion. So these are the open questions, but as such, the civil liability is one of those tools that certainly plays a role in building that type of liability that takes into account also then the victims.
Thank you for that. And I want to pose a final question again from the audience. Thank you to those of you in the audience who are putting your questions in the chat. You are welcome at any time, and I pull them into our discussion when and best I can. So this question, I think I'm going to put this to Mr. Lange. I think you may be best placed to address this. And this is a question about, okay, mandatory due diligence measures at the EU level, fine, but it has major implications for companies in Europe because they are also global companies. They do business globally. This goes back, I think, to the concept of the level playing field, and we also heard from Mr. Bunning those words, fair competition. So you and your colleagues, when you were working on the resolution that was passed in March, how did you take into consideration these concerns about ensuring that European companies can stay competitive globally?
First of all, as I mentioned, the system has to be practical, not a bureaucratic monster. And therefore, for example, the use of digital tools is important. So the artificial intelligence to analyze situation and analyze risk is important. To give also some handbooks and guidelines from the Commission, as we did in other legislation as well. Also, the question of collaboration between specifically small and medium-sized enterprises is important to support this, and also to integrate industrial schemes which are functioning quite well. And if they are certified and representing the same values, then we want to integrate them. And then we have also to reflect to give access to finance. Specifically in the supply chain to smaller suppliers. Sometimes it's not easy to get money for the improvement of their working conditions. So this has to be in our mind in the creation of the whole legislation. And then, of course, we want to have contact, and we are in contact with our counterparts in the United States, for example, with my colleague Richard Neal and Mr. Blumenauer in the Congress, discussing the situation and trying to find a way to establish a common view on more support and improvement of human rights and supply chain. At the moment, yes, we are the front runner, but I guess specifically under the new Biden administration, there are also some reflection how to act. And in the frame of OECD, of course, yes, we want to have this European standard as a global standard at the end of the story.
Well, I think those are very good words to close us out for this panel. I really appreciate all of our panelists for joining us. I know our audience is keen to know what developments this space will bring. So all I can say is stay tuned. And many thanks to our whole panel for being with us this afternoon. I want to turn now to our next panel, a terrific panel where we get to broaden the lens a little bit. We've taken the last 30 minutes to talk specifically about that component of the smart mix, which has to do with mandatory due diligence measures. But there's also room for the smart mix, which is also voluntary measures, supportive international measures, etc. And this panel is going to speak to us about that right now. I'm very pleased to welcome Helena König, the Deputy Secretary General for Economic and Global Issues at the European External Action Service, Rachel Davis, the Vice President and co-founder of SHIFT, Teresa Anjinho, the Deputy Ombudsperson at the Ombudsperson Office, the National Human Rights Institution in Portugal, and Nadine Laan-Honighaus, the Executive Director of the business grouping eConsens here in Berlin. So thank you all for being with us. And Ms. König, I want to turn straight to you with the question about, can you update us about the External Action Service latest work around a comprehensive framework around business and human rights and the implementation of the guiding principles?
Thank you very much, Julie. And it's a real pleasure to be here and in an all-female panel. Very happy to see that. Always encouraging. So moving then, of course, we've been, the EU and member states have been in the forefront of all the global efforts to implement the United Nations guiding principles since the adoption 10 years ago now. You've already in the last session, and I listened in on that one, which was interesting, heard a bit from DG Justice and Director-General Sastamoinen talking a bit about the upcoming legislation when it comes to mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence across the supply chains, which is an interesting, of course, very interesting and eagerly awaited initiative. But of course, we have a set of wider actions. Not only do we have due diligence legislation already in place, and you probably all know about the timber regulation and the requirements on corporate sustainability reporting. We also have a number of our member states who already have national action plans in place, 15 of them actually, which is, I think, a strong support. We're doing a lot of things with international partners when it comes to supporting what is done through projects. And there, I think it's one of the key things for the European Union as a whole is actually working very closely with international partners. We don't always want to rebuild the wheel, but we actually want to work with something which is already in place and agreed on. And of course, a very important part of that is our EU delegations in third countries. And there we're really talking about the international dimension. How do we work with third countries? How do we work with actors in third countries to bring the UN Guiding Principles agenda forward? So with that, we'll take a new step when it comes to leading this implementation and reinforcing our leadership when it comes to business and human rights. We adopted, the Council of Ministers adopted in November last year, the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy for the years 2020 to 24. And within that, there is a dedicated section on business and human rights. It's obviously a very strong component of this is to further strengthen our leadership. Again, a close cooperation and engagement with partners on the implementation of the guiding principles. We have identified 4 key aspects in this. The first part is, of course, engaging with states, other countries, to support them when it comes to developing and implementing their own national action plans for the guiding principles. Very, very important, again, linking back to the previous section, is work with the private sector. Again, we're talking about building a business case for including due diligence and business and human rights considerations into the management plans and their overall business plans. And I think other actors have already said that there is a push on European level, but it's absolutely clear that many countries that are European are in the forefront. So there's plenty of work to be done outside Europe also. On the multilateral level, supporting the agenda, of course, of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights of the UN, including, which I think is very interesting, the roadmap for the next decade. It's about how can we do this better, but it's also about reflecting the new challenges that we've seen during the decade we've had the plan in place. And the fourth part, and that brings me to our framework for business and human rights. It's, of course, how do we ensure that we have a coherence between what we do internally and how that is transmitted externally. And the EU comprehensive framework is built on the shared commitments of member states, knowing that we need to work on actions that will bring forward the implementation of the guiding principles, understanding that we only can do that by being coherent among ourselves. So that is a starting point, coherent and coordinated as member states. It is a bit early to see where we will land on all that. We're just starting the work. Things go a bit slower under COVID, but still there is a lot of enthusiasm, I think, for working for this. We're looking at, of course, what can be done better at national level. And there is a lot about sharing experiences, best practices, in particular for those 15 member states who already have national action plans. How do they develop them? How is the implementation going? The second aspect is looking at the EU level. And you've already discussed during these sessions a number of the EU initiatives that are already in place. And I mentioned some of them in the beginning, but also, of course, the new things that are coming on stream, where, again, due diligence is one of the, I think, most interesting initiatives. But there are also work on decent work in supply chains. There's work on trade and sustainability in our FTAs, but also in other instruments. And there's a lot of work on sustainable corporate governance, not only on the governance itself, but also on the reporting of that governance. Again, most of that is really aimed at making sure that we insert this in a holistic business plan. And last but not least, it is the international leg, of course, where we're talking about global standards based on the guiding principles, support for other countries in developing their national action plans, and again, we will see how these three legs can work together. So I think I'll stop there, but these are the first step we are taking. We're bringing together experts on the EU side. And then, of course, we would like to continue our practice of consulting also with civil stakeholders, with all stakeholders, actually. But I think that is something that will come in the second place once we've had our first meeting and see where we get. But one thing which is sure is that there's huge commitment from member states wanting to bring this agenda further forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Koning, for sharing with us those initial plans and impressions about what factors will be important in that comprehensive framework. I want to turn straight over to Rachel Davis here, joining us from Shift. Rachel, you've been involved for some time in thinking about what would good look like when it comes to a comprehensive EU framework on implementing the guiding principles. Again, going back to that word aspects, what aspects, key concepts, key activities would make such a framework effective based on your experience and your view?
Thanks very much, Julie, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I really welcome Ms. Koning's comments. I think that policy coherence and that kind of a coordinated policy framework is particularly needed now, given the sudden proliferation of legislative activity at EU level that we've been hearing about. And I think, on the one hand, it's very exciting to see so many legislative initiatives, and they have a fundamental role to play in advancing the UNGPs. The UNGPs always envisaged mandatory measures would be a key element of implementation. But they're all focused on this concept of due diligence. And so there is a bit of a risk to manage here that we end up with some different, slightly nuanced, potentially competing definitions of due diligence with different ambitions, different rationales. And I think it's really important that we all remember what the purpose of due diligence is, that due diligence is not a goal in itself, it's a means to an end, and the end is better outcomes for people. And to have a policy framework that can remind us of that objective and evaluate what the EU is doing and indeed what member states are doing against that objective and constantly remind us to measure up to it, I think will be extremely important. We need to make sure that we are incentivizing businesses to engage in addressing systemic harms in global value chains. We don't want them de-risking supply chains or exiting from challenging contexts, because that seems like the way of managing new legal risk. It would be really perverse if these exciting legislative developments that are intended to have better human rights outcomes were to lead to a result like that. So we need the sort of policy measures that sit around that to prevent against that kind of result. So I think that a framework, member states have called for this kind of a framework for a number of years now, and I think including Finland, Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands, and I think it's really exciting that it might now happen. And I think the Finnish agenda for action that they developed during their presidency in 2019 actually still has a number of elements that remain very relevant today. And I'll speak to two of the levels that Ms. Koning was mentioning. The first is, what can the EU itself do? And I think in addition to obviously this role in addressing the fragmented legal landscape, enhancing access to remedy through legislative measures, particularly DG Just's Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative, the two other areas are really around enhancing development cooperation programs that have the aim of addressing business-related human rights risks, where the EU has a very particular ability to also bring other governments into collaborative discussions, so production country governments into collaborative discussions about root causes like low wages, for example. And in addition to that, the free trade agreements, there is potential in the trade and sustainable development chapters. We haven't, I think, yet realised that potential. And so the focus on wanting to really strengthen the monitoring of those chapters and really involving affected stakeholders in those monitoring and impact identification processes is key. And then in terms of what the EU can support at member state level, in addition to, I think, this need for a bit of a peer dynamic, peer review around NAPs, there is a risk that NAPs become lists of things that exist rather than plans for concrete policy action, and peer review and, frankly, peer pressure and competition can help prevent against that and I think help them move up in terms of progress. The other area I would really highlight is the opportunity to encourage the use at member state level of the critical levers of state financing and public procurement. We've actually got some significant experience now in integrating the guiding principles into export credit and development financing approaches within the EU. The UN Working Group has highlighted this. And there's a real opportunity, I think, for some leadership on what that means, and then some more work in the area of public procurement as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for giving us a sense of where this comprehensive framework could go and what good might look like in that future. I now want to turn to our other two panelists to give us some impressions before we hopefully can take some questions from our audience. So our panelists here represent some groups that would be affected by a comprehensive EU framework from the perspective of affected people, Teresa in Portugal, and from the perspective of companies, and particularly companies that are active in many countries. And that perspective we can get a bit today from Nadine. So, Teresa, I want to turn to you at the National Human Rights Institution in Portugal. You have the opportunity to hear from people who have been harmed by business conduct. And how do you think a comprehensive framework from the EU level might support your efforts to ensure that those people have access to remedy and to, frankly, prevent those kinds of harms from happening?
Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you very much to all distinguished participants and guests. The Ombudsperson Office in the latest years has been following quite closely the issue of business and human rights, namely integrating European and international networks of NHRIs, the ENRI and the GENRI. And we have been doing this not only because we do recognize that more and more private companies are governing relevant dimensions of society and transforming the way human rights are exercised and, of course, also violated, but also because we are receiving more and more complaints that are related to business and human rights, from the so-called modern slavery cases related namely to the seasonal working, like in the agricultural sector, to abandoned quarries resulting from the construction of dams, to lithium mining, and also lack of access, for example, related to digital transition. These cases are not exclusive to Portugal, but they do give us a very important insight. There are important governance gaps, namely at the level of awareness. And this is important. Why? Because with awareness, we have a lack of participation. And if we have a lack of participation, we have a lack of trust, which is behind the success of most strategies, being public or private. So if we recognize that there are good effects from businesses, if we want to maximize the businesses creating value and contributing to development, we have to look at the dark side. We have to face the negative impacts. And the Business and Human Rights Framework, the UNGPs, it gives us this promise, the three-pillar promise, in a very balanced way of rights and duties between companies and states. And we should be doing this not only because, as we heard today, it is the right thing to do, but also because it is the smart thing to do. We will be securing development, we will be securing value, we will be promoting the so-called clean companies that clients, investors, shareholders more and more want. We will be developing frameworks of mitigating risks, reputational, litigational, financial. What people need to understand, states and companies, is that we are facing a bottom-up movement that will not go away. In other words, we are facing a movement that is led by the citizens, by people, as we have seen in climate change. So allow me to be a little bit dramatic. I mean, we are at a turning point. It is a question of adapt or die. And in this endeavor, it is quite important to look at the NAPs. We heard about that today, so I'm not going to develop much. NAPs are not the silver bullet, but they can be game changers. As we heard from Soledad Munoz saying, of course, NAPs are welcome, but they cannot be isolated. We need, of course, other measures, but they are important because they give us a very systematic and coherent framework of hopefully smart mix measures, optimum that can balance the criterion of effectiveness and adequateness, but also because they give companies something very important, that is a little bit more certainty in an already very complex and difficult legislative building, that in a polarized world, as we heard the High Commissioner saying this morning, maybe companies will not have the appetite to go for another legislative instrument or treaty. The NAPs allow us to create speech. Someone already spoke about this. The common language is so important because that will raise awareness to society and to business community. So, and I believe this is important as an experience point of view, being involved in the drafting of the Portuguese NAP, because Portugal still does not have a national action plan. What is clear for me is the importance of an EU business and human rights framework. And why? Because an EU business and human rights framework offers us an added value that can raise our collective ambition in terms of having a systematic and coherent approach that at the same time gives flexibility to member states to embrace new challenges and maybe even important differences, geographical and regional differences. And why was this clear for me? Because I had to look at the European landscape, international also, but let us look for the sake of this conference to the European landscape. As we heard, I mean, well, it is true that we can speak about progress at many levels and even leadership of the European Union. However, we also don't have all member states, Portugal as an example, having national action plans. And the ones that have national action plans actually have significant shortcomings. At procedural level, for example, participation, transparency, measures that are not specific and consequently they are not verifiable, neglect in terms of access to remedy, no success in the smart mix, lack of mechanisms of monitoring. So for me, it is very certain, I believe for us, that it is certain that if we want to secure an ambitious and EU-wide coherent implementation of the UN guiding principles, because we believe that they are key for the future that we want, we need this framework. We need actually a European action plan for business and human rights that gives us, good quality, minimum standardized criteria at the level, for example, if we're speaking about NAP, of drafting, implementation and monitoring. EU can and should be active in monitoring and also helping states to compare efforts, which is really very important, and learn from each other's experience, the so-called peer pressure that we heard about. I could get into the most important issues, but they were already mentioned, like disclosure and reporting, mandatory due diligence, public procurement, very important, access to remedy. So to sum up, I do believe this is a necessary path, as we heard. And the EU has, again, in this issue, an opportunity to show leadership, to put people and the planet in the center, but believing that at the same time, the European Union will be enhancing a new business culture that will be more resilient, that will be more competitive, and that will also be more prosperous. Lead by the example. We heard that today as well. We need to ensure that business and human rights are not only buzzwords, they are an agenda for action, they are the key for the future we want. And because the last question was, what is good today? I heard once the Special Rapporteur for Poverty for privacy rights, saying that its critical friend is good, better, best. Let us not stop before good is better and better is best. So this is my critical friend as well. And I believe that in this quest, we are not only late, but we have no time to lose from the perspective of civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa, for your very strong support for that comprehensive framework. Nadine, I want to go straight to you. Your member companies would obviously be certainly impacted by a comprehensive EU framework on business and human rights. Where do you see the opportunities therein and perhaps some of the risks?
Thank you very much, Julie, and thanks to my fellow panelists. Happy to meet you here. Maybe just one short sentence on e-consents and on the nature of our network. We have 38 member companies, internationally operating companies from a variety of sectors. But one has to say they're kind of not representative like for the mainstream German economy, because many of them have been involved very early on business and human rights. Some were involved in the development of the UNGPs, even in consulting processes. So they're kind of first movers, if one can put it like that, among these groups. So, but still, also one has to say, of course, they do see and recognize the values and opportunities, some of which we can really say, of course, there's the known ones as reliable supplier relations, risks mitigations in supply chains, things like that. I think I don't need to elaborate on that. But there are new coming up. I mean, there are new target groups like investors, increasingly asking very specific questions on potential human rights risks also to companies. And the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance is really putting that into a system where companies also have to prove, and in the end, it will have an effect on access to capital, whether the human rights due diligence is kind of really making sure that people are not harmed. But we do need to think about a couple of things, and that lets me turn to the challenges. It is still human rights due diligence and improving the conditions for people. It's still a matter of scale, and it's still a matter of impact. And change for people. And I really liked what my co-panelists were elaborating on, particularly Rachel. Thank you very much. Because we do see, of course, that a combination of measures also can provide kind of an enabling ecosystem for all actors in the field to improve situations and effects on people. And I mean, buzzwords mentioned like trade agreements, like development cooperation, like EU infrastructures in place in the countries, cooperating with businesses and helping companies. We do see a lot happening on the German level. Our members supported the National Action Plan in its first round and really were involved in developing it and giving recommendations. We do have a national dialogue in the automotive sector and many sector dialogues coming up also on the national and also on the European level. So we think that this enabling system should address these challenges best by looking at a few key factors. Companies in this environment need room to focus really on the risk-based approaches, on the systemic risks in supply chains. There needs to be enough space to do root cause analysis and really address many of the issues that are known and not maybe address all of the potential issues, but think from an impact perspective on the rights holders. There needs to be support provided to businesses in the EU and beyond in particular. Companies need incentives and safe harbor regulations and things like that. Coming up with really intensive engagement, for example, in sector dialogues would be clearly welcome and foster participation. We would love to see the European Union encouraging sector dialogues, also providing and talking about resources for multi-stakeholders to get engaged in sector dialogues, to give it time that dialogue can establish, that stakeholders can be heard, that sector guidelines can be developed and peer learning can be established and increased. There needs to be a common understanding of collaboration in terms of impact and also in terms of performance measurement, because that also what this social taxonomy within the EU framework in the end will bring. We need to measure the impact. We need to measure what we do. And only multi-stakeholder approaches can get us to solutions that are commonly accepted by all stakeholders in the field. In the end, I will see also, I liked what Helena was saying, that really it is very important to look at coherence with the EU plans on all different levels, CSRD, social taxonomy, environmental taxonomy going on. Because in the end, companies will have kind of one documentation to report on the issues that are considered relevant. And somehow, in German, you have the saying, the Quadratur des Kreises. So you kind to make the circle kind of into a square. This problem, turn the circle into a square, can't lie with the companies all by themselves. So there needs to be assistance in that. And what I personally would like to stress, because I meet a lot of people that are very motivated, but particularly in multinational companies, have to address systemic issues in a very comprehensive and systemic way, is an atmosphere of mutual acceptance and understanding from all stakeholders alike, and maybe with all ambition, the patience to give things some time to develop and evolve. And I know that this is urgent because there's human lives that need to be improved. But on the other hand, particularly with the German situation, we have a national action plan. We will have mandatory, there will be EU mandatory. We're talking again about national action plans. And time sometimes can deliver quality outcome also to approaches. And I would like to bear all actors to bear that in mind. Thank you very much.
Nadine, thank you so much for sharing those perspectives and wishes with us in terms of what a effective and meaningful comprehensive EU framework would look like. We're running a bit over time, so I want to pose one, I think, pressing question from the audience that perhaps is briefly answered, and that would be by Ms. Koenig, please. And the question is a very pragmatic one. When can we expect a European action plan on business and human rights?
Thank you. Well, let's take one thing at a time. I think the important part for us really is putting in place this framework. And the framework is really, the aim is to see how we best implement the UNGPs. And as I said in the beginning, part of it, a very important part, is actually to support those member states who don't have national action plans. Then what kind of format that will take in the future, I think it's a bit too early to say. I think the important part is really what do we achieve with it? And several of you have mentioned that we have to have a mixture between sometimes mandatory parts and smart parts, smart initiatives. And I think that's really key, particularly if you want to connect into business. And there's a lot more to this than just having mandatory rules. And I think for us, we need to really get the discussion going internally in the EU. Again, we're coming off to a good start because there is a commitment to want to discuss this, want to get out better on the other side. Where that will lead, I think it's really too early to say. I think for us, the most important part now is that we really reinforce the implementation of the existing UNGPs. And then we will take it from there. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that reaction to the audience question. So with that, I want to say a very warm thank you to all of our panelists. You've provided tremendous food for thought for where it might be going with an EU comprehensive framework on guiding principles implementation. So thank you so much for being with us. And I'm now going to turn to our final focus session of the day. This session is really an opportunity to go big and talk about the last 10 years and the next 10 years and beyond. So I am extremely pleased to welcome some speakers today who we foreshadowed very early in the day. We began with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, for example, talking about the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And I'm so pleased to welcome two members from that working group with us today, as well as a member from the OECD Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct. So now I'll introduce you by name and thank you for joining us. Mr. Dante Pesce, the current chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and the executive director of the Vincular Center at Catholic University of Valparaiso in Chile. Anita Ramasastry, a member of the UN Working Group as well, and professor of law at the University of Washington in the United States. and Christine Kaufmann, Chair of the OECD Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct and Professor for International and Constitutional Law at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. Thank you all so much for being with us. This panel is a chance to talk about where we've come from and where we're going. So Dante, I'd like to begin with you. It's tremendous to have you with us today. And as we know, the UN Working Group, as part of this UNGPs 10+ project, we've heard it referenced a few times today, supported by the Foreign Office here in Germany. One of your activities was to undertake a stock-taking exercise of the last 10 years. I think you're going to go to publication pretty soon with that exercise, and I think our audience would be very keen to hear some of your major findings about what's gone well, what maybe hasn't gone so well in guiding principles implementation over the last decade.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation and for having me here. Let me start by saying that the process of evaluating the first 10 years of the implementation of the guiding principles started as a process something like 2 years ago with a very significant engagement with the government of Germany. And as it has been mentioned before, it's our main sponsor to take stock of the first 10 years, but also help us develop our roadmap into the next 10 years. And that roadmap will be a second phase of this project that I will describe in a minute. Just one thing that is quite remarkable. This process of listening of what has worked and what has not worked that well brought us, and we opened the door for expressions and for written comments. We got almost 250 written comments from all the spectrum of stakeholders from all around the world, including indigenous people, including unions, and of course, including business and governments. But it's a very robust process that we put in place to listen. And we organized more than 30 ad hoc consultations to discuss about the guiding principles first 10 years, but also we piggyback in about 50 additional events that took place around the world, again, to listen. And the first main conclusion that I can share with you, because as you said, Julie, we're going to publish this stock-taking report, and it's going to be public on the 16th of June this year, the same day that we will celebrate the 10th anniversary of the guiding principles, and it will go out in 6 languages, all the official UN languages. And the main conclusion is that we are having a half-full glass conversation. 10 years ago, there was a lot of skepticism. The guiding principles were welcome, but it was, let's say, something to be tested. If they were useful, they were implemented, they will, let's say, a real contribution, or it was more good intentions, again, good intentions in paper, but with weak implementation. Today, from all stakeholders, some of the stakeholders consider that we are in a half-empty conversation, so there's a lot of room for improvement, and some stakeholders consider that it's more a half-full glass. But nevertheless, it's a conversation around a glass that has something inside. And the starting point is that we do have the guiding principles. We do have the 3 pillars as a starting point for many conversations. And we are having a discussion on the quality, the strength, the speed of implementation, but not if the guiding principles are applicable or not. We know they are. We're trying to move from pilot phases, early adopters, pioneers, to mainstreaming and moving from incremental to exponential. And we have some key obstacles that we have identified, and let me get through some of them quite quick. One is the lack of policy coherence, and that has been mentioned before today, not only at the government level, but also at the multilateral level. And governments, for the most part, at the UN and multilateral level, but also at national level, are not leading by example, are not really implementing, and are not actually implementing even you have an app, and including many other elements like public procurement that was mentioned already, but also trade agreements and how business and human rights is included in the trade agreements, but actually monitored in its implementation, and how local governments and in the relation with Europe is actually turning something into more practical measures on the ground. ground. The other thing is developing business models that do not undermine human rights. For example, in the context of supply chains, purchasing practices, and in digital technology. Overcoming silo agendas, notably the SDGs and climate change policy arenas, where we still see lack of connection, which is, from our point of view, an obvious connection to make, but we don't see a lot of connection taking place in reality. We have a need for better corporate human rights performance data, including better disclosure. And to design the right responses, we need to know what works and what doesn't. And we have a weak knowledge management in general. So we have anecdotal information, but we don't really have systematic information that can allow us all to learn. And based on learning and knowledge management here is key, we can make improvement. There's also a need to better track state implementation more systematically, including enhancing the role of UPRs, for example. But there are so many areas where we can improve monitoring actually what our governments do or do not do. There's also capacity gaps among stakeholders, including those who have to implement, for example, governments and business, notably SMEs, but also national human rights institutions, communities, civil society, etc. And we need to develop adequate support structures, for example, in the form of capacity building funds and an international help desk function that is yet to be fully explored. This wasn't the agenda 10 years ago, but it was not fully implemented, or I will say it was not implemented at all in many aspects. The capacity building challenge and that capacity building across all stakeholders and jurisdictions. And the last decade has also underscored the point made in the guiding principles. Voluntary approaches alone are not enough. That has been discussed today a lot. Mandatory measures are now on the race. But at the same time, many decades have demonstrated that legal measures are essential, but we will not alone be able to ensure business respect for human rights. And that is why we need the smart mix that has been, of course, part of the conversation today. In the context of my region, Latin America, what we have discussed is hard law is welcome, soft law is welcome. Sure, they are welcome, but what is needed is hard implementation. So this smart mix can look differently in one region or other. The point is that we need to stress the implementation element, how hard the implementation it is, and do we have the right incentives in place? So I will leave it here to leave some room for, I hope, a second round, and the floor is back to you, Julie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dante. A very good overview there. You referenced at the end of your remarks the critical point around capacity building, ensuring that those who need to implement responsibilities and duties under the guiding principles can do so. And the world is only becoming more complex, and the capacities then to do business with respect for human rights, perhaps even more challenging. And I want to turn now to Anita to address this point of we are living in a time of challenge for global business, for global workers and communities, as well as governments. If we look to the next 10 years of guiding principles implementation, how do you see the complex and changing times we are in now affecting our trajectory and perhaps our impact?
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to the Foreign Office for the invitation to be here today. I really want to focus on where we are, and as you mentioned, we are coming out very slowly from a pandemic. We're in a period of recovery, but we're also in a place of tremendous challenges geopolitically, and I gather from some of the earlier parts of the dialogue, we've talked about some of those challenges. So where does that put business and human rights? And a few points, and I think Dante did a great job of sort of saying, what have we learned from a decade? We're at, I think, a natural turning point. After a decade of experimenting with the guiding principles around the world, we're now in a place where we can say, well, what is the next decade going to look like? The first thing I would say is that there's a greater expectation that business has a very strong role to play leading globally, especially in times of uncertainty or chaos, that business is really there to stand up for the rule of law, for resilience, and for really embracing the notion that all stakeholders matter. So I think there's an expectation that business should and will lead in this next decade. The second point I want to make is about this idea of responsible recovery. What we've learned from the pandemic is that the guiding principles are a very important tool for companies. I call it a future-proofing tool. What we've seen is that companies that invested in the guiding principles or in similar types of human rights due diligence and impact assessments have really performed well on capital markets and economically for themselves, but also for their workers and for their communities, because they had invested. They had not waited for there to be regulation in order to use human rights due diligence to say, what kind of impacts should we be thinking about for our workers, for our employees, for supply chains? What investments do we need to make? And the companies that had already been doing that and had processes in place were able to respond to the pandemic, either because they already had approaches and strategies in place around issues like layoffs, safety for workers, what kind of pay and benefits they should have, or because they could quickly do so because the human rights due diligence tools of the guiding principles allowed them to do that and to pivot very quickly. Just Capital and some really interesting academic research has just come out in May of 2021, ranking companies in, for example, the top 100 in the United States around companies that were future-proofing using the guiding principles in human rights really are doing well. So they do well, but we have to remember what the pandemic has shown us is that resilient workplaces, resilient workers, human rights are important for all of us, whether it is a worker in a factory making essential equipment or an essential worker that is actually working in an office. That we need everybody, we need resilience. And so I really want to emphasize resilient capitalism is what I focus on, requires this approach of looking at human rights and responsible business. The last points I'll make are just really that we've also learned that we need this better integration, and we're seeing this in Europe, of course, with the discussion of mandatory human rights due diligence, of how we look at the environment, how we look at issues of corruption and responsible business, and how we look at human rights as a holistic ecosystem. And we'll hear from Christine Kaufmann, who really lives and breathes this at the OECD, which is how do we bring responsible business as a holistic approach to life? We haven't done that as well as we could, and I think in the next decade, that's going to be a big challenge. So I'll just leave just at this point by saying that what we've learned is not only to value human rights, because it is about valuing the people that are behind any business, and that's really important for resilience, for recovery, and that the guiding principles are an important tool, but that we also are seeing this idea of due diligence and this idea of regulation as a competitive advantage. That we've reached a point, and we did this with anti-corruption decades ago, is that governments and businesses and civil society that invest in ethical and responsible systems, and now that would include human rights as part of the ingredients, right, lead to competitive advantage for companies, for marketplaces. And it's really good to see that Germany is taking a leadership role here in sort of elevating human rights as part of that mix and as part of that competitive advantage.
Anita, thank you so much for those remarks. Big picture thoughts there, which is a great way to close out our day of dialogue. You talked quite a bit about opportunities and challenges for companies going into the future, an opportunity for leadership, but in a challenging world. And so I want to turn to Christine now to share with us some thoughts about those opportunities and challenges for companies and their responsible conduct into the next 10 years. At the Working Party, you've also been taking this 10-year opportunity to do a bit of a stock taking, a look back, so we can learn for the future. And can you share with us, I know your process is not as far along as at the UN Working Group, can you share with us some early findings, perhaps also around the National Contact Point System, which is one of the key systems that we talk about when we talk about responsible business conduct and business and human rights?
Thank you very much, Julie. That's with pleasure. I will do that. I would also like to thank the German government for providing us with this excellent opportunity for an exchange. I was carefully listening to what my colleagues from the UN said, and also had an opportunity to listen to at least two of the sessions earlier in this day. And I think when I talk about the OECD guidelines, there are two distinctive features that are very important for our discussion. First, it's the scope of the guidelines. They go way beyond human rights. And 10 years ago, at the same time when the UNGPs were adopted, the guidelines were revised precisely with a view to integrate the key principles of the UNGPs also in the OECD guidelines. But they have other chapters too. So essentially, all areas where business would interact with society are mentioned in the guidelines. And that helps a lot to connect the different issues, as it was mentioned by Dante, it was mentioned by the High Commissioner this morning. So essentially, this holistic approach, it's safe to say, is in the DNA of the guidelines. And the other distinctive, unique feature is really the grievance mechanism, a non-judicial grievance mechanism, these NCPs, the national contact points. Well, I'm often asked the question, what are they? I mean, who is contacting them about what exactly? They have a double mandate. And I also think that's important for looking into the next 10 years. They have a mandate to handle cases related to responsible business conduct involving companies that operate within their territory or from their territory. And that's very important because some people think, well, it's only 50 countries that have adhered to the guidelines, so it's not a big scope. But these national contact points, they have been around for 20 years now, handling these instances, these cases. They have addressed more than 500 cases taking place in over 100 jurisdictions. So the scope is very broad. And if we look at where are we today, and we're in a similar exercise as the UN Working Group, but of course it's a different process. We have already seen some achievements regarding the NCPs, the national contact points, and I would just like to share some of the achievements, so some of the part of the glass that is full. I think we agree that the glass is not yet full. There's empty parts, which I will get to also in a moment. And I think we have some key ingredients for success. And success, I would define as Rachel did in a previous panel. It's really making a difference in people's lives. So we don't want to write principles for the sake of having principles. We want to see a difference, and we want to improve the situation on the ground. And what we see now from this rich experiences with our NCPs is really that it's crucial for business to look at the whole supply chain, go beyond the first tier, and also go beyond national boundaries. We all know supply chains don't stop at national borders. And we often hear the argument, well, it's way too complicated, it's too much of a burden, particularly in a pandemic. But we also see in the very manifold contacts that our national contact points have with business in promoting responsible business conduct standards, in talking to them, how are you implementing due diligence on the ground, that the companies that have a sound system in place do much better in terms of crisis. And many companies and businesses will also tell us, once we got started, we not only found risks, we also found opportunities. New business areas that we didn't even know of, we're really good at. So this is, I think, an important role of these national contact points that we probably tended to underestimate a little bit, is to demystify due diligence and the implementation of the standard and really apply a very pragmatic approach. How can it be done in the real world? And the OECD has issued several guidances in close contact also with the UN and the ILO, and that really helps a lot. And another important lesson that we learned, and it relates to what Dante also mentioned, the world doesn't stop in Europe and it doesn't stop at national borders. So taking local context is incredibly important for a variety of reasons, and also the engagement with non-adhering states and countries. So there's a lot of projects going on. It was mentioned, I hope, this morning by Livius Andrea from UNDP, the project in Asia, for example. There's another one very important where there's close cooperation. Also Dante is involved in Latin America, where adhering countries come together with non-adherents, share experiences, and also make different regions of the world to become part of the solution. And this is, again, a very important lesson that we learned. Now, needless to say, the world isn't what it used to be, not only with the pandemic, it's climate change, it's digitalization, it's global supply chains that are very complex, it's new business models, new corporate structures, and contracting practices also. And in this landscape, internationally agreed and aligned standards on responsible business conduct are extremely important. And I really emphasize aligned, because since the beginning, the ILO, the UN, and the OECD have cooperated very closely to make sure that we have a coherent package of internationally aligned standards that are more likely than to be implemented by businesses and governments alike. Nevertheless, this being said, we also see the empty part of the glass. What we see, and specifically now in the remedy part, in the grievance mechanism part, is that sometimes parties are just unwilling to engage in procedures before national contact points. And this is where governments really can play a crucial role by setting clear expectations based on these international agreed standards and setting some incentives for companies and business to engage. And speaking about governments, I would also highlight what I would call some homemade challenges that NCPs are faced with, or as Guy Ryder put it this morning, I could also call it a source of frustration. There is an issue within the system itself. Sometimes NCPs, or not all NCPs, are visible. They have different structures. They are not always easily accessible. Timeliness is an issue, and not all of them are in a position to ensure equitable and safe proceedings. We do have 50 governments committing to establishing such effective national contact points, but there are at different levels. Procedures vary greatly. And in fact, and again, turning to what do we want to achieve, and we want to improve the situation on the ground, it should not make a difference for people affected which national contact point they turn to. And it's very clear that if we want the system to be fit for the next decade, we have to take action. And we have to take action now, making sure that these challenges are addressed and that the system remains credible for all stakeholders. And we do think, and we see that there is some sort of a quick fix. And the quick fix could really be that governments are providing more resources to national contact points, that they review institutional structures, and very important that they ensure that stakeholders are adequately involved. But we cannot stop there. We also see that there is a need for a more systemic approach, and that relates to what Anita and Dante were just saying. We also need to look at the bigger picture, and in the remedy part, that's really the overall landscape of remedy mechanisms available. And we heard in the previous session from NHRIs that are playing an important role. And this is really where the stock-taking exercise that the Working Party is currently engaging in comes into the picture. So here the question is really, are the guidelines as they stand today, are they fit for purpose in the next decade? And specifically for the national contact point system, that asks the question, is the role that national contact points have according to the guidelines today, is that adequate? And is the way these NCPs are being told to operate, is that still fit for purpose? So this is something the Working Party is looking at, the guidelines and the procedural guidance. So in sum, I would say it's clear the glass is not yet full. Business not completed, as it was said this morning. But I also think at the same time, we now have 50 countries very actively engaging from across the globe in a comprehensive stock taking with a view to really ensuring that the guidelines remain fit for purpose. And for me, that is really a reason for optimism. So I leave it at that and hope we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Christine, for sharing those reflections with us. Something that I've heard throughout this day and certainly throughout this discussion has been the importance for companies to engage, to get involved, to ask themselves the tough questions, to take a look at their total value chains. And we've heard a lot of conversation about why they should be incentivized to do that, what their incentives might be. I want to, as we close our day out, talk about the opportunities for business with the responsible business conduct approach, with the guiding principles approach. And Anita, I want to turn to you for this question. You referenced explicitly this area around opportunities and seeing that when companies take a view to human rights due diligence and considering these factors, they also support their own stability and resilience. That was your big word. Can you talk to us a little bit about the opportunity for business to get engaged, to put the resources in that are necessary, to have the open ear to being involved that has been called for throughout our day today?
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. And I really want to, and I think Christine and Dante did a great job of reminding us of the larger reason that we focus on the guiding principles, right? It's about changing the lives and making sure that people that are impacted have access to remedy and that we prevent harm. That's the larger goal. But what we also see is that by doing that, the pandemic showed us that it was important. If we hadn't thought about it before, and I think business is looking at this very closely, we value everybody who is engaged or impacted by business, whether it's a worker or it's a consumer, that we need to think about the human impact of business activity. Once we do that, though, what we really see is that resilience comes from this idea of business taking its own action, being forward-looking, and using human rights impact assessments and human rights due diligence as a way of being able to tailor approaches to human rights impacts. Rather than, so for example, during the pandemic, governments can't always move quickly. They can create things like mandatory human rights due diligence, which is a larger framework. But in terms of things like whether you need 6 feet between people at a factory or whether or not you need masks, those things are, regulation is sometimes reactive. Government can't always move as quickly to think about what's the best design for keeping people safe or for dealing with issues in a particular business. The guiding principles provide that flexibility. It creates a process where a business anticipates those harms and is able to deal with them in a way that is best suited to their own business model. That's really what we talk about with resilience and recovery. I'm sorry, the light in Seattle is shining brightly right now. But it's really to say that this is a great opportunity, right, is to look at human rights due diligence as a tool and a business process that leads to positive outcomes for people, but that also gives business a really great way with dealing with things rather than saying we're going to wait for the state to tell us exactly what that 6-foot distance needs to be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Anita. I want to turn now, we're coming to the end of our day together, and I want to turn now to another very pragmatic question from our audience. Our audience, you've been great at posing just really practical questions today. I think I'm going to put this one to Dante or Anita, as you wish. We talked about the UNGPs 10 Plus project, the stock-taking exercise, and we know that this is then supposed to support a roadmap into the future, and our audience member wants to know, when will we find out more about the roadmap? And maybe, Dante, if you can speak to that. We've done the stock-taking exercise, you've done the stock-taking exercise, and how is it building toward the roadmap, and when can our audience expect to hear more?
Sorry. Yeah, on the 16th of June, we will present the stock-taking exercise, the first 10 years. And that day will go out, as I said, in 6 languages. We will have a soft launch, actually, in South Asia the first week of June at the annual Forum on Business and Human Rights. But the proper launch of this exercise will go out on the 16th. And we will have a sequence of events taking place both in New York, Geneva, and with people speaking from other places, self-organized by the business community, the indigenous, the civil society overall, and unions. And at the same time, we will present elements of the roadmap at those same events. We already have some, let's say, key elements of that are part of the roadmap, and we will start this process again of building a roadmap built on participation. And this process will be wrap up on the 1st of December, at the same time that we end up with the 10th anniversary, the 10th Forum on Business and Human Rights, that goes from the 29th of November to the 1st of December. Of course, by October, the roadmap will be pretty much a done deal because we need a process and we need to publish the results, etc. But that is the time frame that we have given ourselves as a process, starting the 16th of June, wrapping up on the 1st of December, and then with events in between that will be taking place in different locations of the world and piggybacking on opportunities that are being offered to us, including the OECD, in which we will have on the 16th, actually, a 2 hours discussion on the guiding principles 10 plus project in the context of your annual forum, Christine, in Paris. So that's the time frame that we have. And of course, if any of you in this call in this event would like to contact us and to get more details, we're happy to be responsive to you. And we have the capacity in place to actually be able to accommodate proposals or ideas that come from the audience today. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Dante. And I realize for those of you who have been with us all day, we are at the close of our time for this event. So it's been a tremendous conversation. I really want to say a huge thank you to our final big picture panel here. You've done a great job of wrapping up our day. And I want to turn briefly to a few logistical updates before we say farewell for the day. So many of you are aware of the website where you are watching this event live streaming. We will make a full recording of the event available to you on the YouTube channel of the Foreign Office. You can also find the link to that on the website, Berlin Dialogue, bhr.de, which is where you're watching the live stream right now. We will also make available a short summary of this event, and we will share the questions and comments that came in from you, our audience, on that website after the event. So just so that you're aware of that. How to sum up. I'm not going to sum up the whole day for you. All I want to say is that I really appreciate you being with us and being such an intrinsic part of our ongoing efforts. You know, Dante, you said it, it's been a decade of experimenting with the guiding principles, and some of our speakers today shared optimism about the next 10 decades. I think our reason for optimism is because we're in this together. Everybody who's been part of our dialogue today is contributing to that optimism and forward progress, which we can only achieve when we do it together. So with that, I want to thank you for being with us today at the Berlin Dialogue on Business and Human Rights. I'm Julie Schindal. Thank you.